turn to 1 Samuel chapter 7. 1 Samuel chapter 7, and we'll read the first 14 verses. 1 Samuel chapter 7, verses 1 through 14. And the men of Kirjath-jearim came and fetched up the ark of the Lord, and brought it into the house of Ebenezer in the hill, and sanctified Eleazar his son to keep the ark of the Lord. And it came to pass, while the ark abode in Kirjath-jearim, that the time was long, for it was 20 years, and all the house of Israel lamented after the Lord. And Samuel spake unto all the house of Israel, saying, If ye do return unto the Lord with all your hearts, then put away the strange gods and Ashtaroth from among you, and prepare your hearts unto the Lord, and serve him only, and he will deliver you out of the hand of the Philistines. Then the children of Israel did put away Balaam and Ashtaroth, and serve the Lord only. And Samuel said, Gather all Israel to Mizpah, and I will pray for you unto the Lord. And they gathered together to Mizpah, and drew water, and poured it out before the Lord, and fasted on that day, and said, There we have sinned against the Lord. And Samuel judged the children of Israel in Mizpah. And when the Philistines heard that the children of Israel were gathered together at Mizpah, the lords of the Philistines went up against Israel. And when the children of Israel heard it, they were afraid of the Philistines. And the children of Israel said to Samuel, Cease not to cry unto the Lord our God for us, that he will save us out of the hand of the Philistines. And Samuel took a sucking lamb and offered it for a burnt offering, wholly or entirely unto the Lord. And Samuel cried unto the Lord for Israel, and the Lord heard him. And as Samuel was offering up the burnt offering, the Philistines drew near to battle against Israel. But the Lord thundered with a great thunder on that day upon the Philistines, and discomfited them, and they were smitten before Israel. And the men of Israel went out of Mizpah, and pursued the Philistines, and smote them, until they came under Bethkar. Then Samuel took a stone, set it between Mizpah and Shen, and called the name of it Ebenezer, saying, Hitherto hath the Lord helped us. So the Philistines were subdued, and they came no more unto the coast of Israel. And the hand of the Lord was against the Philistines all the days of Samuel. And the cities which the Philistines had taken from Israel were restored to Israel, from Ekron unto Gath, and the coast thereof did Israel deliver out of the hands of the Philistines. And there was peace between Israel and the Amorites. And we'll stop there. There's a lot in these verses. Many messages could be preached on a variety of subjects. What we've just read really is a record of a great revival that God sent upon Israel. God, in these verses, brought them from the heights of their arrogance and pride, brought them from the heights of, or the depths of, treating God according to their own whims, brought them from thinking that a mere outward show of religion was enough to give unto God. God brought them down in mercy, causing them to truly repent. In our text also is the record of God granting victory over their enemies, the Philistines. Also, it's a testimony of God's faithfulness to his people. So these verses, again, there's many subjects filled with life-changing lessons for you and I that are saved. In these verses before us are examples that will bring victory, that will bring peace into our lives. In verses 13 and 14, notice three words. Verse 13, so the Philistines were subdued. Subdued. We see in verse 14, and the cities which the Philistines had taken from Israel were restored. Subdued, restored. And then toward the end of the verse, and there was peace. And there was peace. So this is the result of what we have just read. There was a subduing, there was a restoring, and there was a peace. But we want to take the main thought of the message from an act of Samuel recorded in verse 12. Then Samuel took a stone and set it between Mizpah and Shen, and called the name of it Ebenezer, saying, hitherto hath the Lord helped us. So Samuel erects a memorial. He calls it Ebenezer. That's the name that he gave it. The name simply means hitherto hath the Lord helped us. So we picture Samuel taking a stone, setting it in place. I picture him pointing to it and saying, Ebenezer. It was an acknowledgement of God's hand in their life. It was a declaration of the faithfulness of God. Hitherto hath the Lord helped us. It's an exclamation of the wonder of God's love and God's care. In this act of Samuel building this memorial, I believe that he and the children of Israel at that moment appreciated and recognized the gracious and mighty hand of God in their lives. Again, verse 12, then Samuel took a stone and set it between Mizpah and Shen, and called the name of it Ebenezer, saying, hitherto hath the Lord helped us. And that's our subject this morning, Ebenezer. Ebenezer. Hitherto hath the Lord helped us. Ebenezer, that very word, teaches us how that we need to take time. We need to take effort to recall, to recount what God has done in our lives. We're not even aware of everything that God has done in our lives. We're not even aware of a small percentage of everything that God has done in our lives. But first of all, let's consider some background. The background leading to the text here in 1 Samuel 7. Sadly, the happenings of our text are a picture of the lives of many of God's people. What we read in verse 12 is, of course, deeply embedded in the history of Israel. 20 years before the event in our text, back in 1 Samuel chapter 4, one of the darkest days in ancient Israel happened. In a single day, Israel not only suffered a terrible military defeat, notice in 1 Samuel 4, verse 2, Israel was smitten before the Philistines, and they slew of the army in the field about 4,000 men. Verse 10, and the Philistines fought, and Israel was smitten, and they fled every man into his tent. And there was a very great slaughter. For there fell of Israel 30,000 footmen. And also in 1 Samuel 4 and verse 11, and the ark of the Lord was taken. The ark of the covenant was taken. The ark of the covenant was a symbol of the presence of God. We see it almost everywhere in history of Israel. With the loss of the Ark of the Covenant, Israel was no longer conscious of the presence of God in their life. And at the end of chapter 4, verses 21 and 22, it is twice mentioned, the glory of the Lord is departed from Israel. This is far worse than all those who were killed. The glory of the Lord is departed from Israel, for the ark of God is taken. When that ark of the covenant was taken, that was worse than all the people who had been killed. The glory of the Lord is departed from Israel because the ark of God is taken. So the delight and the beauty of life was gone. Was gone. The Philistines, chapter 5, verses 1 and 2, brought the Ark of the Covenant to Ashdod, and they housed it in the house of their god Dagon. And we all know what happens there. God intervened, and the ark proved to be a great trouble to the Philistines. We read that in verses 3 and 4 of chapter 5. And out of fear, the Philistines brought it to Gath. From there it was carried to Ekron, verses 9 and 10. Chapter 6, verse 1, and the ark of the Lord was in the country of the Philistines 7 months. So there it is in Ekron, 7 months. And then the ark was returned to Beth-Shemesh, and the Israelites were overjoyed to see the ark. We see that in verse 13 of chapter 6. And they offered sacrifices. But there was a problem. They desecrated the ark by opening it and looking inside. Perhaps they thought they had good reason to do so. Perhaps they were looking to see if the tablets of the law were still there. And the result was 50,070 men were killed. Notice verse 19. And he smote the men of Beth-Shemesh because they had looked into the ark of the Lord. Even he smote of the people 50,000 and 70 men. And the people lamented because the Lord had smitten many of the people with a great slaughter. As a result of this fear, the result of the fact that they were so disturbed, the men of Beth-Shemesh chapter 6, verses 20 and 21, sent messengers to Kirjath-Jearim to come and get the ark. In chapter 7, verse 1, they came and fetched up the ark of the Lord and brought it to the house of Ebenezer, where it lay neglected and forgotten. We read in chapter 7, verse 2, that it's now been 20 years since that day that the Ark of the Covenant had been taken by the Philistines. Again, that ark was a symbol of God's presence. For 20 years, the people were not conscious of the presence of God. In that 20 years, they wandered off to serve the foreign gods of the Canaanites. As a result, they lived life dominated by Canaanite influence, and they lived in the constant fear of the Philistine armies. And again, this went on for 20 years. During that time, they made up their own designer religion, if you will. What they did was they would mix parts of one thing or another from the surrounding culture, splitting their attention between God and other gods. As a result, they wandered further and further from God. And they forfeited the blessings of the Lord. For 20 years, these people suffered the consequences of decisions that would rob them of God's blessing. Again, sadly, it is a picture of the lives of many of God's people. Many, if not most, of God's people go through their lives oblivious to God. And that's what Israel was doing. No subduing, no restoration, no peace. Just living an unhappy life. So those are the events leading up to our text. Now let's consider the events leading to verse 12, to Ebenezer. 20 years have gone by. We read in verse 2 of chapter 7, all the house of Israel lamented after the Lord. After 20 years, they became aware that their life wasn't as good as it was 20 years ago. They became aware of their sin. The reason that life wasn't as good. And they began to long for the Lord. That's the first step to victory that we read of in verse 11. It's also the first step to recognizing and appreciating the hand of God in our lives. What we read there in verse 12. And it's also the first step to the dominion and restoration and peace that we read of in verses 13 and 14. So the people have recognized we have sinned. And that is why life isn't what it once was. We have sinned. Oh, we want to blame it on a lot of things. But it's usually sin. And Samuel the prophet tells them in chapter 7, verse 3, that if they want to experience the blessings of God, they need to return to Him. Paraphrasing verse 3, he basically says, if you're serious about returning to the Lord, if you're serious about it, then get rid of all these foreign gods. They got to go. And commit yourselves to the Lord. And serve Him only. It's not just serve Him, but serve Him only. If you do these things, the Lord will bless you. The people respond. In verse 4, then the children of Israel did put away Balaam and Ashtaroth and served the Lord only. In verse 5, Samuel now summons them to gather in Mizpah for a prayer meeting. In verse 6, they poured out water before the Lord there at Mizpah, a symbol of their repentance, and that their hearts were now poured out in sorrow for their sins, and also as a symbol that they were now willing to be spent entirely for the Lord. That needs to be our spiritual state. However, the Philistines, they interpreted Israel's gathering at Mizpah as a military move, as a consolidation of forces. So they gather to battle. And the Philistines, or the Israelites, become exceeding fearful. And they make request of Samuel. Verse 8, cease not to cry unto the Lord our God for us, that He will save us out of the hand of the Philistines. In verse 9, Samuel offered a burnt offering. Again, a symbol of their complete dedication to God. And then he prayed. In verse 9 we read, and Samuel cried unto the Lord for Israel. And in verse 10, as Samuel was offering up the burnt offering, the Philistines drew near to battle against Israel. But notice there in verse 10, but the Lord. The Philistines drew near to battle, but the Lord. But the Lord. But, of course, is a conjunction. It's a word that connects. It's a connecting word. Connects to another group of words. In this case, what follows the word but, the Lord, is connected to the Philistines drew near to battle against Israel. Conveys the idea of on the other hand. So the Philistines drew near to battle against Israel. On the other hand, the Lord. On the other hand, the Lord. So those three words, but the Lord, nullifies, reverses, overrules the Philistines drew near to battle against Israel. That nullifies everything the Philistines are doing, but the Lord. Speaks of God's intervention. Again, but the Lord. Those words provide a turning point. It is but the Lord thundered. He did something. So they're life-changing words. You read them over and over and over. But the Lord. And oh, what wonderful words. How many times in our own lives we can insert those words. But the Lord. but the Lord. And what happened, what the Lord did was He granted victory. Which brings us to verse 12. Then Samuel took a stone and set it between Mizpah and Shen, and called the name of it Ebenezer, saying, Hitherto hath the Lord helped us. So let's look at this act of Samuel. It says, then Samuel, fully aware of the presence and intervention of God, fully aware that it is God that has made a difference, he takes a stone, he sets it, both deliberate acts, taking the stone and setting it, and with a heart filled with wonder and praise and thanksgiving and joy and worship, he sets it between Mizpah and Shen, points to it and calls it Ebenezer. Hitherto hath the Lord helped us. Samuel was recognizing what God had done. He was appreciating what God had done. And I believe the people also recognized and appreciated what God had done. Keep in mind, the people had been brought to a condition, to a spiritual condition, whereby they could recognize what God had done. There are a lot of God's people who are not in a spiritual condition to recognize the hand of God in their lives. But Israel has been brought to this spiritual condition where they can see what God is doing. We need to live our lives in such a condition that we can recognize, that we can appreciate the intervening hand of God in our lives. So this act of Samuel is an example to us. And that brings us to the memorial and some application to ourselves. You read verse 12. It's not a memorial. That stone, Ebenezer, it's not a memorial of their hard times. It's not even a memorial of their victory. But notice, hitherto hath the Lord. It's a memorial of God. It's not a memorial of their victory. Hitherto hath the Lord. It's a memorial that God has intervened in our lives. God has helped us. That's the memorial. There are people who will say, this is a celebration of the victory. No, not really. It's a celebration of God. And what God had done. Hitherto hath the Lord. Hath the Lord. A memorial of what the Lord had done. Hitherto hath the Lord. A memorial is something that is set apart for the purpose of preserving the memory of something. Memorials are reminders for the purpose of arousing memories. Why do we need them? Because we forget. You see memorials all through the Word of God. The first that comes to mind, of course, is the Passover. It's a memorial. Israel was often charged by God of forgetfulness. He says in Deuteronomy 32:18, "Thou art unmindful and hast forgotten that God formed thee." Oh, how unmindful we are. Oh, how much we have forgotten about God. You get to a certain age, and I'm there, and you realize that you've forgotten more than you know. There's a lot of truth to that. A memorial was set to prevent us from forgetting. And Samuel wanted the people to know the Lord has intervened in your life. And every time you look at this stone, you remember that. Ebenezer. God often exhorted His people, remember. Remember. That is, recall to mind. In Deuteronomy 24:9, it is, remember what the Lord thy God did. Remember what God did. We have this tendency to remember what we ought to forget and forget what we ought to remember. Remember, Paul said, forgetting the past, I press toward the mark. There are a lot of things we need to forget concerning the past. You need to forget all the times you've been mistreated. You need to forget those things. But you need to remember what God has done. You need to remember what God has done. It's a memorial, Ebenezer, of the intervention of God in their lives. Hitherto hath the Lord, skip a word, us. So there's a connection between the Lord and us. And it's a memorial of what God had done for them. What did He do? He helped them. Hitherto hath the Lord helped us. Help comes in a lot of different ways. In fact, it comes in so many different ways that we fail to recognize it for what it is. God sends a sickness in your life. That could be God helping you in many ways. God takes someone from your life, same thing. Help comes, of course, in the form of assistance. We limit it to that. God had assisted them. God had aided them. Help comes in the form of relief. Someone relieves you of something, that's help. God cures you of a disease. That's a help. Don't forget, sending the disease can be help also. God restores something. That's help. It's also help if God takes something. We may not recognize it as such. Help comes in the form of preservation. Help comes in the form of prevention. You and I have no idea of all the things God has prevented in our lives. But help comes in the form of prevention. The devil says, I'm going to do such and such to so-and-so. And God says, no, you're not. That's help. It's preventing help. It comes in the form of deliverance. Oh, all the things that God has delivered us from. Help comes in the form of provision and supply, guidance, direction, instruction. Help comes in the form of enablement and empowerment. Hitherto hath the Lord. We read in 2 Chronicles 14:11, and Asa cried unto the Lord his God, and said, Lord, it is nothing with thee to help, whether with many or with them that have no power. God doesn't need means to help you and I. He may choose to use means, and He may not choose to use the most powerful of means because He doesn't need to. Because it's not the means, it's God. Hitherto hath the Lord. The help is not in the means. The help is in the Lord. To provide, God may give you a job. But really, the provision isn't in the job. It's in the Lord. Be careful where you place credit. Be careful. So our text is a celebration of the present help of the Lord. When Samuel erected that memorial, it was an act of praise for what God had just done in their lives. This requires an acknowledgement of God in their lives. It requires an awareness and an acknowledgement that it was God and not themselves. Samuel knew what really transpired. Oh, that we would know that. Well, I was there, I saw it happen. Yeah, but did you realize what happened? You can see a lot of things happen and not realize what really transpired. And if you remove God from the picture, you haven't really seen what has transpired. Hitherto hath the Lord. His perception was accurate. When Samuel built that memorial, he was calling attention to God. He was paying tribute to God. He was appreciating God's hand in their lives. So it was a memorial of the present. It was also a celebration of the past help of the Lord. Ebenezer, meaning hitherto, hath the Lord helped us. That word hitherto, it's not a word we often use. It's a wonderful word. Hitherto, it looks backward. And looking backward, it brings what has transpired into the present. Hither to. Backward to the present. So it is a word that scans or views the past and brings it up to the present. And Samuel says, hitherto hath the Lord helped us. He says, I look back and I see God's hand. And I bring that all the way to the present. And I see God's hand. Hitherto hath the Lord. He says, I look back and I see God is faithful. And I follow that all the way up to this hour. And I see God is faithful. I look back and I see God's grace. I see God's mercy. I see God's care. And I bring that all the way to the present. And I see God's grace, His mercy, and His care. Hitherto hath the Lord helped us. Samuel knew that during those 20 years of departure and wandering from God, God was helping them all that time. Were it not so, they would have been destroyed. Our text also is a declaration of faith concerning the future. The word hitherto is a word that speaks of the past, the present, and causes us to say confidently with the psalmist, Behold, God is mine helper. Psalm 55:4. God is my helper right now. How do I know that? Because He's been my helper in the past. He doesn't change. Psalm 121:12, My help cometh from the Lord, which made heaven and earth. But the word hitherto also points forward. Hitherto is not the end. Hitherto, that's not the end. There's still more distance to be traveled. There will be more distress. There will be more difficulties. There will be more trials. There will be more battles. There will be more struggles. There will be more burdens. There will be more disappointments. If you think you've experienced your final disappointment, that'll only be true if you're taking your final breath. There will be more. There will be more sorrows. And there will be more joys. There will be more spiritual highs, and there will be more spiritual lows. There will be more temptations. You may have gotten victory over a certain temptation, but there will be more. And there will be more sickness, and there will be more health, and there will be more needs, and there will be more times to spend in the desert, and there will be more storms to go through, and there will be more furnaces to walk through. But we can say with Isaiah, in Isaiah 50 and verse 9, Behold, the Lord will help me. The Lord will. Hitherto hath the Lord. It is, God has been faithful throughout my entire past. God is faithful right now and will continue regardless of what comes. So you read verse 12 and apply it to our lives. We too can say, Hitherto hath the Lord helped us. Well, how do you know we can all say that? We're here, aren't we? We wouldn't be were that not the case. Hitherto hath the Lord helped us. But just like in our text, sin in the lives of God's people will lead to the failure to recognize God's hand. Will result in lives of defeat, lives of great unhappiness and despondency. People will often say, I'm so unhappy. Well, why are you unhappy? Oh, and here come the reasons. 99.9% of the time, none of the reasons they give are the reason. None of them are. They've convinced themselves that these are the reasons, but that's not it. I'm unhappy, so I'm going to move. I'm unhappy, so I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. Thing is, they're still unhappy because those aren't the reasons. Those aren't the reasons. Because everywhere they move to, they go with them, and there's your reason. There's your reason. Oh, if I just get rid of so-and-so, if I just get away from so-and-so, I'll be happy. They get away from so-and-so, and guess what? They're still unhappy. Because so-and-so wasn't the main reason. So it is with you and I. Before we'll ever consistently recognize, appreciate God's hand in our lives, we must be in a spiritual condition to do so. Ebenezer. ought to mark our lives. It ought to mark our lives. Hitherto hath the Lord helped us. The main and central focus of that statement is the Lord. Hitherto hath the Lord. Ebenezer should be our confession as children of God. You can look all through the Word of God, and you can recognize the hand of God in the lives of the ancient saints. But do we recognize it in our own lives? We need to be in a spiritual condition where we can recognize God's hand in our life. We sing the hymn, Come Thou Fount. The second verse goes, Here I raise mine Ebenezer. Hitherto by thy help I come. And our life is filled with Ebenezers. A lack of spiritual hindsight. I said spiritual hindsight. We don't lack carnal hindsight. A lack of spiritual hindsight is a real problem for God's people. We need to learn how to look backwards. We need to learn how. We need to know what to remember and what to forget. Well, how do you do that? Well, it's really very simple. If it doesn't help you spiritually, you need to forget it. If it doesn't draw you closer to God, forget it. And if it draws you closer to God, remember it. It's very simple. Didn't say it was simple to do. It's very simple precept. We need to look back, learn how to look back on our lives and to see what really happened. What really happened. Go back as far as your memory can go. You go all the way back there, as far as your memory can go. And then, hitherto, you bring it into the present. What do you see? As you scan the road that you've traveled. To get to now, you had to travel quite a distance. So as you scan that road, what do you see? What do you see? As you scan that road that you've traveled, there were times along the way of alarm, times of fear. There were times of distress. There were times of difficulties and trials. And on we could go. But what do you see? Is that all you see? Oh, back then, that was such a difficult month. That was such a difficult year. And just listen to people talk. As they look back, that's all they see. Oh, yeah, I remember brother so-and-so said something to me back then. That's all they see. That's all they see. But what do you see as you scan that road? If we're in a proper spiritual condition, we can see God's love, God's grace, God's mercy through it all. You know how much grace it took to get you and I to here? No, none of us know. But it was abundant. How much mercy along the road transpired to get us to here? How much long suffering? How much of the enablement of God into our lives? So you look back And you might view some of the desert places, and you might view some of the empty places, and you might view the storms, and you can remember some of them, and you remember some of the furnaces you walked through, and you remember some of the dead ends that you came to in life, and you remember some of the mountains that you climbed, and you remember some of the valleys that you traveled through, and you remember some of the crooked and rocky roads. But can you see God's deliverance as you look back? Can you see God's provision? Can you see His guidance? Can you see His enablement? Can you see His protection and His preservation? Looking back, at the time, we did not know, okay, why is this happening in my life? But looking back, you can begin to put some pieces together. And you say, okay, I can see. I know why that happened. It's God's hand in our lives. Hitherto hath the Lord helped us. We need to be in such a spiritual condition that it is our habit to recognize God in our lives, and that we can celebrate God in our lives. Looking back and seeing God prepares us for the present and the future. Notice in Acts 26. Acts 26. Verse 22. Acts 26, verse 22. Having therefore, this is Paul, obtained help of God. Having therefore obtained help of God, I continue unto this day. So it is with you and I. Having therefore obtained help from God, we continue. We continue on. You press forward. You don't get stuck. But you press forward in the business of God. Because hitherto hath the Lord helped us. So you see, looking back, seeing God's hand, there's strength to go on. There's strength to go on. Oh, but this trial that I'm going through is bigger than any trial I've ever gone through in my life. That may be so. May not be so. But it really doesn't matter. It's not the size of the trial that matters. That's not the issue. The issue is God. And He hasn't changed. So continue on. So continue on. Proper looking back, we see, great is thy faithfulness. Great is thy faithfulness. And we see the wonder of God's love and grace, giving us assurance for the future. So look back through it all. Look at the road you've traveled. You say, oh, there's a lot of things along that road that I'm ashamed of. That may be so. It's true of all of us. But God brought you through it. But God brought you through it. Remember who it was that intervened in your life. And now we can say with Isaiah 50 verse 9, behold, the Lord will help me. We know it because that's what He's done. That's who He is. Hitherto hath the Lord helped us is true of each one of us. Brother Ben, if you'll come and lead us in a verse of song.